Hello, welcome back. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about how we organize the living world, how we try to make sense out of the diversity and variety of living things in the world. Let's consider the way in which we do this. Humans seem to have, as a very basic tendency, this desire to take things and begin to organize them, put them into groupings, identify things, label things, name things. It's an essential part of science because it helps us communicate. And let's take a look at one of the ways, or some of the ways, in which we do this. We tend to use a hierarchical organizational scheme, and you're going to see that in a number of different ways as we talk about this. You'll see how we rank things or put them into groupings from smaller groups to larger groups, or you can think of it the other way around, very large categories and then subdividing it into smaller categories. And one of the ways we do this is by looking at the components of the living world around us, and one of those features is to look at the organization of life based upon an upper level of an ecosystem. Well, as you take a look at this, you can see that we're dealing with a sequence of organizational levels. We have the ecosystem level here, and the ecosystem would include all of the organisms in an area plus the physical and the chemical environmental conditions of that area. But we could subdivide that ecosystem into a community of organisms. Then we would be just looking at the living things in a particular area. If we take just one type of organism and look at a group of those organisms, then we'd be down at the population level. We'd be looking at a group of one type of organism. Now, of course, we could look at this hierarchy from the other point of view and say, okay, if we think of organism as being sort of the central location, think about what we've just done. Individual organism, get a bunch of them together, we have a population. Add together all the different populations in a region, and we have a community. Take that community of organisms and include the physical and chemical environment, and now we have an ecosystem. By the way, some people would even go one step higher and say that the Earth itself is a combination of ecosystems, and they might use the terminology of talking about the biosphere. Well, let's consider the organism from another perspective, because the organism we could think of as being composed of organ systems. So we're taking an organism, and in a sense we're breaking it down, going to the smaller levels of designation. Organism, organ system, organs. All right, so think about what I'm talking about. Circulatory system. What would be an organ of the circulatory system? The heart. The heart itself is composed of different types of tissues. Those tissues are composed of a variety of different kinds of cells. If we go down in our hierarchy one more step, then we have the cell being composed of molecules. Now, as you're going to see right away in our next chapter, we're even going to consider things at levels lower than this, because we'll talk about atoms, and then we'll talk about subatomic particles. But these are the levels of organization. These are the levels of study that most concern biologists. Oh, atoms, subatomic particles. Now we get into the realm of what is mainly the interest of chemists and physicists. So these will be the levels of organization. This will be part of the hierarchical scheme of life that we're going to be interested in investigating. Most of our work this semester is going to be done at the molecular, cell, and organism level. All right, so we're going to be looking at molecules and cells, and to some extent the organ system, organism level. But most of our focus is going to be at that molecular cellular level of the hierarchy. Now, one of the things we try to do is we try to take the living world and we try to organize it in a way where we can put things together, separate things from each other based upon their similarities and their differences in terms of their characteristics, their physical appearance, their makeup. As a matter of fact, nowadays our taxonomic schemes even use molecular differences among organisms as a way for us to try to organize them and put them together. Well, our classification scheme, one thing you want to realize is it's subjective. What that means is that it's not an absolute scheme. It's something that we've made up. It's something that we've developed over time. It's different than it was in the past. and it's probably going to be different in the future. So our present system isn't necessarily the one best system or the one system that's always going to be used. You should expect that any component of science, and taxonomy is one of those components, that one of the features of science is that it is going to change over time, that it's going to be added to and taken away from and rearranged. That's part of the nature of science in general, and that's true for our taxonomic schemes as well. Here's what we presently use. It's another hierarchy again, with domain being the largest box, the highest level in our taxonomic hierarchy, and then each of these other levels is a subdivision of the one above it. So domains are broken down into kingdoms, and kingdoms into phyla, plural, phyla, and those are broken down into classes and orders, families, genus, genera, plural, and species. And so that's our hierarchy. One of the things that you're going to want to do this semester is at least have some awareness of some of these levels. We're not going to focus on all of them, but I do want you to know something about the key domains and kingdoms we're going to be dealing with. And I also want you to be aware about how to correctly represent the genus and species level, the lowest two steps in the level, of some organisms. And those terms will come back later. These other classifications, phylum, class, order, family, we won't deal with quite as much. Now, as an example, let's take an organism like yourself, and let's see what some of these hierarchical levels in our taxonomy would be for a particular organism, a human being. We're in the domain eukarya, which I'll explain more to you about later, but that basically means we're organisms that have a nucleus in our cells. We're in the kingdom Animalia. We're in the group of animals that have a backbone. That's the easiest way to think about it. So we're in the phylum Vertebrata. We're in the class Mammalia. And just think about that class for a moment and the name. You can see that that must represent all organisms that have qualities that we consider to be similar enough to be classified as a mammal. Milk production, hair on the body, four-chambered heart. Those would be some of the characteristics that we'd associate with all members of that class Mammalia. We're in the order Primates, which actually groups us together with the other apes and monkeys. So that's a subgroup of the mammals, the group of mammals that we're most similar to in terms of our physical appearance and makeup. We're in the family Hominidae. That would include, by the way, those organisms that we tend to refer to as individuals that are cavemen, Australopithecus, for example, or some of those primitive fossilized remains of humans that we found, or human-like organisms that we found. We're in the genus Homo, which means man in this case, and then we're in the species Sapiens, which, depending upon how you interpret it, means intelligent or wise. So we've been very nice to ourselves in terms of how we've named our individual type of organism. Notice that I've written the scientific name for humans, Homo sapiens, and I've written it two ways. Please make note of this, because when you see scientific names, you're going to want to make sure that they're represented in the correct format. Notice italicized, underlined. This type of naming system, these scientific names that we give to living things, is a key tool used for communicating among biologists. It's what's referred to as binomial nomenclature. And let me give you an example of why it's important. If I was talking to a friend of mine who was in Finland or Sweden, and they said to me that they were going to be working on a study of elk, well, right away, as soon as I say that word elk to you, you get an image in your mind of a particular kind of animal. Well, what they are referring to when they think of an organism called an elk would be what we in this part of the world would call a moose. So common names can be confusing. The same common name might be associated with two very different organisms in different parts of the world. So because the elk, our North American elk, has a specific scientific name, a two-part name, Cervus canadensis, we know that that's distinct from the thing that people in Northern Europe might call an elk, which we would call a moose, which is Alsus alsus. So those scientific names are specific to one particular kind of organism. And everybody around the world has come to agreement about which scientific name they'll use for a particular organism. Notice, it is a two-part naming system, binomial nomenclature. And as I mentioned before, the two parts to that name are the genus and the species name. And the way it should always be presented, if people are being careful about using scientific names, is that the genus name is capitalized and the species name is not capitalized. Then, importantly, there should be some clear designation of that name being distinct from the normal typeface that it's written with. So one of the common ways to do this is to underline the genus name and the species name, like here in Streptococcus mutans. By the way, this is the bacterial organism that causes tooth decay, dental caries. Notice you could also write its name in an italicized form, Streptococcus mutans. But what we're trying to do is clearly delineate this name as being different from the regular typeface that it's written with. So look for that when you look for scientific names, and if you're asked to write a scientific name, please make sure you're careful to write it in this correct format. Well, think about what we talked about in this presentation. We talked about the idea that we like to organize life, that we do this organization mainly in a hierarchical scheme. We use a means of naming things that's a scientific naming system called binomial nomenclature. This process of naming things and organizing things is a science or a branch of science called taxonomy. And those different levels of that taxonomy, the domain, the kingdom, the phylum, and so forth, are the different taxa that we've made use of. Now, you'll want to take a look at the other video on taxonomy, where I'll take some of these ideas and I'll expand on them and talk about them a little bit more. Thanks for paying attention. We'll see you next time.